Stronghold, naval base, strategic centre, Singapore is above all one of the ramparts of that freedom for which the British Empire stands. The importance of Singapore as a naval base can scarcely be exaggerated. All shipping to and from the Far East must pass here under the eye of British naval patrol.
Throughout the 1930s, Britain had been steeling herself against an ever-increasing Japanese threat to her Far Eastern Empire and the dominions of Australia and New Zealand. Japan's imperialist ambitions had been demonstrated by her invasion of mainland China, following her withdrawal from the League of Nations in 1933. To counter, Britain built a defensive strategy around the pivotal naval base of Singapore, one of the 4 greatest naval fortresses in the world. But this commitment to security, based solely on naval power, was to prove a costly mistake. And so too the belief that Singapore was invulnerable to land attack from the Malayan Peninsula.
That is the way the site for the dock was cleared. But of course over the vast hinterland of Malaya, the jungle still stretches. It's about the thickest in the world, and progress through it would be impossible except by hacking out a path.
They surely underestimated. I mean, we were told when we got to Singapore that the Japanese, all short-sighted, they can't see more than about 4 feet in front of them, that their pilots are useless, they've got rotten airplanes that are fall to bits. That kind of story went around. For instance, we were told that the Japanese had no tanks, that the trees are in such a position where it wouldn't allow tanks. And that was the kind of thing we were up against. Anti-propaganda from this end, or bad propaganda, if you like, against the reality of which the Japanese had.
Yes, Singapore is well equipped and prepared to deal with anything which may arise in the Far East, and at the same time to reach out a protective arm from the Cape to Hong Kong, from Aden to Darwin.
But the outbreak of war in Europe and the relentless tide of Nazi advances soon compelled Britain to reassess her strategy. The fall of France, Italy's entry into the war, and the disaster of Dunkirk left the British Isles isolated in Europe. The substantial Royal Naval Forces, originally earmarked to defend the Far Eastern Empire, could no longer be spared from the desperate struggle in Europe and the pressing need to protect the lifeline of the Atlantic convoys.
They felt that as the priorities were with the Atlantic convoys and the Russian convoys and the Malta convoys, that the best ships we had should be kept around here, which was vital. And so, in order to put up a show maybe, old battleships like the Queen Elizabeth and the aircraft carrier Hermes, the only one I think we could afford to send there, were operating in the Indian Ocean.
These heavily armoured ships with massive guns had been built to win naval battles with accurate, hard-hitting bombardment. In the Pacific, naval warfare was about to change forever.
Here are many miles from far Nippon on the Pacific. Our carriers creep toward Hawaii, and all preparations on board are completed. Now the greatest air attack in the annals of war will be carried out in a few moments. On the morning of Sunday, December 8th, squadrons of Nippon bombers speed toward Hawaii in dim light.
Japan's imperial ambitions were finally unleashed on the 7th of December 1941 with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and simultaneous assaults on the Philippines, Hong Kong and Malaya. Overnight for Britain, a European conflict had become a world war. She responded by dispatching 2 of her greatest capital ships, the brand new Prince of Wales and the Repulse, to attack the Japanese landings on the Malayan coast. But with no air support, the 2 ships fell victim to Japanese air attack, and in Britain's own version of Pearl Harbor, were sunk on the 2nd day of the war. In one blow, the core of Britain's naval presence had been effectively swept from the Far East, leaving Fortress Singapore to be overrun by Japanese land forces.
All the water, for instance, came from Malaya into Singapore. And the first thing the Japanese did, of course, was to turn the water off. And all the hospitals, which were absolutely brimming full of patients, found they had no water. That we only had about 4 days' rations left. That the ammunition was so low that it was probably about 6 or 7 rounds per gun left. I think that surrender was really the only thing that could have happened to save lives. I suppose really during that time we went through a tremendous psychological upheaval, if you like. First of all, I suppose, if you're honest with yourself, there was some relief, because at least you could stand up without being shot at. And then, of course, we had heard what the Japanese had done to other prisoners, and terrible anxiety comes into it then. You don't know what the hell's going to happen. You're just floundering, if you like. And then, of course, you go through a third stage of being bloody angry. Who put us in this situation?
The fall of Singapore was the worst military defeat in British history, leading to the capture of 130,000 British and Commonwealth troops by a Japanese force less than half their number. The pattern of rapid conquest was repeated in Burma, where the Japanese drove the British forces through the jungle to the gates of India. By capturing Burma in 1942, the Japanese gained control of vital oil and rubber supplies and cut the Burma Road, the only overland supply route to the Chinese army. In the Pacific, the Japanese were finally halted by the Americans at the Battle of Midway, and in the mountains and jungles of New Guinea by Australian forces. For Britain, 1942 was the nadir of the Second World War. Germany and Japan were at their strongest. Russia was reeling in defeat. America was barely mobilized. Britain's communications eastward were severed by Axis domination of the Mediterranean. The fight against Japan had to be fought from India. With Japan at the limit of her conquest, Britain and America agreed to split their offensive. With America supported by Australia in the Pacific, Britain commanded the Southeast Asian theatre. Under Lord Mountbatten, a Commonwealth force of Indian, African, Gurkha and British regiments began the slow and painful process of clawing back Burma from the Japanese. In the dense rain-soaked jungles, Burma was to be a war of foot soldiers.
The whole of the time I was in there until the war ended in August 1945, we were in action the whole time, and as I've said, I was never without malaria the whole time, in some degree or another. I was never without dysentery the whole of the time, in some degree or another. I was covered from head to foot in sores, jungle sores, ringworms, pellagra, you name it, I had it. It was a dreadful place to be. It was a dreadful enemy to fight, because he was never beaten until he was dead.
Fighting against the largely unseen enemy in the dense Burmese jungle, troops were under constant threat of attack.
In the jungle, you were probably only 75 yards away from your own men, and you never saw them for a fortnight. I mean, that's what it was like. And you just each little section probably operated under its sergeant. You might not see an officer for days or something like that.
Sometimes they come at night time, 2 or 3 people only. One is on right flank or left flank, one is some behind it, hiding themselves. They will fire 4 or 5 rounds or more than that, sometimes machine gun fire. And then we didn't know where they have gone. And we were thinking that they have circled our army. But actually they were only 3 or 4 people only.
The anticipated Japanese offensive into India finally began in the winter of 1943 and culminated in the siege of Imphal and Kohima in April 1944. But the British, Indian and Gurkha troops under General Slim doggedly held out. Supplied by air, they awaited reinforcement.
We ran out of ammunition, we ran out of food, we ran out of supplies, we ran out of everything. And here began the first massive, major airdrop of the whole of the war. And we had a lot of chaps killed because of the immensity, really, of the supplies coming down by parachute and without parachute. And the things bounced about, you know. The order was to get into slit trenches, but sometimes these things, these crates and bales of ammunition and food and so on, they went down inside a slit trench. You had no chance, and chaps were killed there and then. So that was day and night for 3 weeks, battling up against close quarter fighting with Japanese crack units.
And in that 26 days, I experienced, we had only no ration at all, full ration. We were on chocolate and plus biscuits, plus tea ration. And After nearly 2 weeks, this biscuit ration was also finished, and we have a half biscuit at that time. That was a terrible life at that time. Monsoon is there, and jungle is also there.
When relief finally came in June, the Japanese were routed. They had begun the campaign with 85,000 men, and in it lost 53,000. In all, they were to lose over 100,000 men in the Burma campaign.
I was told by my commanding officer to search one of the bodies. I think they were wanting to know what the unit was. And so I searched this chap, and as I took papers out of his pockets, some looked like, of course not being able to read Japanese, some looked like something like our own documents, army book, telling what regiment or whatever you were. And then it absolutely floored me when I took out of his pocket a photograph of what would be presumably his wife and 2 children in their kimonos. And it absolutely floored me, because I suddenly realized that here was a man, whatever he'd been like and whatever he'd done, he was a man just like me.
As the 14th Army began to drive back the Japanese in Burma, the tide of the European war also began to turn. Britain was able to divert more resources to Southeast Asia, and by the end of 1944 was once again able to establish a Pacific fleet.
The Navy is here. That now applies in a big way to Far Eastern waters, as well as to the seas nearer Britain, where naval engagements have been furious and frequent. Great victories have been won against the Italian fleet and against the savage onslaughts of the U-boats. And so, although the Atlantic is not yet a haven of peace, a vast proportion of our strength has been transferred to the Pacific. This is some of it.
After being driven from the Pacific in 1942, the Royal Navy returned in strength, committing over 500 ships to the conflict, the largest British fleet of World War II. The terrible loss of HMS Prince of Wales and the Repulse had shown the importance of air power, and the aircraft carrier had now become paramount in naval warfare.
On the 1st of January, 45, we set off as on the first operation of the British Pacific Fleet, which was to attack the oil refineries in the northeastern part of Sumatra.
The first real test we had was at Palembang, which became the first really strategic blow that the Navy had delivered for a long time, where we had to fly something like 180 miles from the fleet over some pretty rough terrain, mountainous jungle, to get to the target. And then we had 4 carriers loads of aircraft, something like 200 aircraft involved, of which half were bombers and half of them were fighters. So we were able to make a pretty good mess, first of the Palembang oil refinery, and then on a succeeding raid, 2 or 3 days later, the one beside it, which really made quite a difference to the war in the Far East, because the Japanese were running short of oil.
The fleet then went on to Sydney, where the welcome was remarkable. News of the raids on Palembang had gone ahead of us, and people turned out in their thousands to welcome the British Pacific Fleet. They set up a centre in Sydney called the British Centre, and the hospitality was unbelievable, and they were so keen and thrilled to see the fleet back out there again.
HMS Howe's stay in Sydney was short. There's work to be done in the Pacific. The Guard of Honour presents arms as the Rear Admiral in charge of Sydney Naval Establishment comes aboard.
At about the middle of March, we set off again, this time due north. Bearing in mind the distances, 4,800 miles from Sydney to Tokyo, and I think about 3,800 to our destination, which was Okinawa. And our job was to neutralize the islands in the Sakishima group, because they were being used as staging points for the Japanese to bring up aircraft, and they had coral airstrips there. And our job was to make them unsurfaceable.
Okinawa was the final stepping stone to a full-scale invasion of Japan, and Japanese resistance reached a ferocious pitch with squadrons of suicidal kamikaze dive bombers attacking the fleet.
It was a fairly nerve-wracking experience, like being on a sitting duck. I mean, the worst time I ever had was, fortunately for me, being the boss man, I was right in front of the range to fly off, and we had a full deck range. I mean, every aircraft was going to do a strike. And so all the Avengers, all 40 of them were fully laden with about 4,000 pounds of bombs each, all with full tanks. And suddenly I see these kamikazes. One was trying to hit the Indom, which I could see from where I was sitting in the aircraft with the engines were all running. We were turning into wind, actually, to fly off. I couldn't get off that deck quick enough. And another one came whistling over our head. And I tell you, when you're strapped in a cockpit, sitting on sort of 200 gallons of high-octane fuel and all that load of, you don't feel at all comfortable.
This Zeke banked round our bow, and I waited until I saw him turn in, and then thumped the gunner in front of me on the back and shouted, "Fire, fire, fire." The 8-barrel pom-pom, or Chicago piano as they call them, to my right, just forward, was beginning to blaze away, and also the other Oerlikon gun to my left. I think I must have been certainly one of the last people to see this Japanese pilot alive. I can remember vividly that he was wearing green and yellow silks and goggles, and just seconds later he'd crashed into the base of the island, killing, I believe, 11 and injuring 14. And there was very little of him left, or his plane.
One of our carriers is hit by a diving suicide bomber. Flames rage on board, but the carrier lives to continue the fight.
It had flight decks built of steel. And of course, when the kamikazes came down and hit us and exploded and everything went over, and it didn't take us long to clear it off, and we were flying on and off within an hour or so, these attacks taking place.
One by one, our carrier planes return to face most precarious landings on the pitching flight deck. Crashes are inevitable, and to save all important stowage space, badly damaged planes are dumped into the sea.
I think 93% of the aircraft had to be replaced during the operation, either from enemy action or planes that were ditched or crashes on landing. And at the end of a virtually 3-month period, I think most of the aircrew were getting very, very tired. So we weren't too disappointed when the Americans finally took Okinawa and the fleet went back to Sydney to recuperate.
In Burma, the 14th Army continued to drive back the Japanese, making a largely unopposed amphibious landing at Akyab in January 1945. As the Japanese resistance continued to crumble, optimism that the end was in sight began to rise.
The speed with which we did the 300 miles from Mike Tiller to Rangoon, and we did it in 21 days, and when you're fighting, and that's a 12 mile a day is a terrific speed. It was constantly stopping, setting up guns, firing, packing them up again, following the infantry, and it was like that all day.
The only thing was that hanging over us then, because the end of the war hadn't come as such, we knew the Japanese were packing up because we'd really run them into the ground, was the thought that our particular division were going to be dropped onto the Isthmus of Kra, that's the north neck of the Malayan Peninsula, and that wasn't going to be a happy occasion.
Although the Japanese had been forced back on every front, their continuing fierce resistance left the Allied forces with the prospect of invading Japan with an estimated loss of more than 1 million Allied casualties. At the Potsdam Conference, following the surrender of Germany, President Truman revealed to his European allies that America now possessed a new weapon of awesome power, and he would be prepared to use it against Japan if she continued to refuse demands to surrender.
One morning, early in August, somebody, I know not who, announced over the tannoy, very early in the morning, that a plane very high in the sky, which was glinting in the sunlight, would be making history. Now, how the person who said that knew that, I don't know, but they obviously did. And it was the Enola Gay, who was on her way to drop the first atom bomb on Hiroshima. And 3 days later, of course, another force went and dropped one on Nagasaki.
It was a terrible time for the world. I mean, we've had all sorts of things since, but no time do I think that the time of the dropping of the 2 atom bombs and when you see the Holocaust that followed it, it was dreadful, dreadful, and I think people should be constantly reminded.
The horrific devastation wrought by the atomic bomb brought about the end of hostilities. The threat to Australia, New Zealand and India had been finally removed.
On that day, we were on that gun site, and when it was announced that we hadn't to fire on any planes coming over, there'd be Japanese planes coming in with their people and intermediaries to surrender, and we weren't to shoot.
From the defeated islands of Japan, surrender planes have been coming in a steady stream. Escorted by Spitfires, Japanese planes arrive at Rangoon to learn the Allied terms.
That was, of course, a great moment, the greatest moment of all, and I can remember there was a lot of firing into the air on that occasion, people throwing their hats about, and from somewhere, I don't know it come, but a load of Woodford's beer arrived from somewhere, some very thoughtful quartermaster somewhere, and I don't think I can remember very much after that, but I know it was a tremendous relief.
When he surrendered, that was a boost moral for the army, and we were very happy at that time. All the units were happy because the war is going to be finished, as German has already stopped war, and when we have heard that Jap has also surrendered, when we thought that it is war is finished, and we were happy we will go to our families.
The war against Japan had cost the lives of nearly 40,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers and innumerable civilians. Its cessation led to the liberation of thousands of prisoners of war, many captive since the fall of Singapore.
I don't know whether you can imagine what the reaction was in prisoners of war camps when we heard that the war was over. It was, it's one of those things that I shall never forget. In this camp that I was, there were 3,700 inmates, some Australians, a lot of Dutch, and ourselves. And somebody, somewhere at the top of the camp, started what they called the snake. This was, you picked up anything that would make a noise, joined up a conga, and then went right through the camp, picking up other people as you went, until the whole camp was in one long line. And then they went right through the Japanese quarters. And if you'd have seen the faces of the Japs, they'd climbed up onto the roofs. They thought their last moment had come. But of course, as far as I know, none were ever touched.
On the 2nd of September, the signing of the surrender took place on USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, just a couple of hundred yards from where we were. And the ships not in the front line now came up to all the Japanese-occupied territories, Singapore and Hong Kong and Malaysia, and Japan, of course, and in various parts of Japan where we didn't know or didn't realize that prisons actually existed, to bring all these men out.
Tokyo Bay, with Fujiyama, the sacred mountain, shrouded in mist. Along this coastline, Allied prisoners were known to be waiting for freedom. First job was to dash ashore, and there was no mistaking where to look. Many are wearing clothes dropped by super fortresses on mercy missions. Anything up to 3.5 years in captivity, but they can still raise a laugh. After the horrors that have been discovered in some Japanese camps, the first batches of prisoners didn't seem in too bad shape, but we weren't taking any risks.
Many needed months of convalescence before they were fit enough to be shipped home to be reunited with their families.
I remember well the day that they arrived in Southampton. My two elder sisters went to meet the boat. They were not supposed to go on the boat, but when the people on the gangways heard the situation, all the barriers dropped and they were allowed to go on the boat and see my father. I didn't see him until the next day when he came home and arrived by taxi. But I remember the excitement of my sisters as they came home and told me that yes, they had seen him and he was all right.
Although the men of the 14th Army and the British Pacific Fleet were still thousands of miles from home, their victory was greeted with rapturous enthusiasm. VJ Day became a public proclamation that their sacrifices and suffering had not been forgotten. After 6 long years of war, the hopes of the world had finally turned to peace.